All right, our first speaker of the day is Mr. James Perloff, who was actually born and raised in this town of Lexington. He lives in nearby a few towns away in Woodrow.
I'm just from Burlington. Yeah,
Burlington, Burlington. And I actually literally bumped into him for the first time. It was in 1988. I was at the old John Birch Society headquarters in Belmont. I was a young member, and there was this young man, and he had a stack of these books in his hand. And I said, "Oh, excuse me." And he left with a stack of books, and the lady in the bookstore, Sally, said, "That's Jim Perloff, who wrote Shadows of Power." I said, "Why didn't you introduce me?" So it took about another 5 or 6 years before I finally got a chance to meet him, and we've been very honored to have him speak at our events. He's been up at our camp. In fact, I want to invite you to a weekend camp. Mr. Perloff wrote this, probably one of the most important books. That before it was fashionable to talk about the deep state, he was writing about it. This book, which I highly recommend you get, The Shadows of Power, The Council on Foreign Relations and the American Decline. It's an extremely readable book. It's one of these books you can put down, you don't want to put down. And I won't mention all the books, but there's another one that I think is also very important. Because what's the first verse in the Bible?
In the beginning.
In the beginning, God. Now that's not. They're not talking about baseball either. All right. In the beginning, right? In the beginning, God created. And there are a lot of people out there, especially those who call themselves Christians, that don't believe the very first sentence in the Bible. And if that very first sentence can be up for grabs, I would say the rest of it can be up for grabs too. So, and Mr. Perloff, what I love a lot about him, but he used to be a 60s lefty, burn baby burn.
Wow.
And something happened to him.
The
Lord got a hold of him, right?
Wow.
Yeah, so how many 60 hippie commies, former hippie commies, do we have in this room?
I wouldn't really say common.
We got 1, 2.
Yeah.
You qualify, okay.
Well, 80s. So,
80s, really? Yeah.
Yeah.
I have to say I was never a lefty.
Yeah.
When I was in elementary school, I remember the teacher said something about Joe McCarthy. And I said, "Why is he a bad guy?" Because he was mean to communists. I said, "What's wrong with that?" Anyway, this book called Tornado in a Junkyard. And it's another highly readable book. It's really not written, you know, he's not a microbiologist. You know, he's a man who just did a lot of research. And it's, there was an English, he was a scientist that said the probability of us evolving from slime is the probability of a tornado going through a junkyard, and in its wake is a 747 or something like that, right? Probably you have a better chance of 747 than so it's an excellent book, and he's got a few other. He got one on COVID-19, Red Pill, which was banned from Amazon. Surprise, surprise. Yeah. So yeah, again, I go back to 1988. Jim, we used to write for the New American Magazine. A lot of his articles have been archived. A lot of his articles are timeless. And he's going to be talking about a chapter in our history which very few people know about. It was prior to our involvement in World War I. So let's give him a nice warm Camp Constitution hand.
Okay, so as Hal was saying, Memorial Day we honor those who have fallen for their country, and I just want to stress that anything I said, it is not meant to demean their memory or the valor of United States soldiers. The title of this talk might be "Wars are not always fought for the reasons given," and some of us would call that an understatement and would say that they're usually not fought for the reasons given. To exemplify this, I'm going to talk about a war that's long forgotten, that I've never written about. And some of you may have never even heard about it. You know, when I was in school in the 1960s, it was in our history books, but I'm sure you wouldn't see it there today. What I'm talking about is America's making war on Mexico, invading Veracruz in 1914. Anybody you ever hear of that? No, nobody. Okay.
I have.
All right, all right. It wasn't a full-fledged war, but almost became one. It almost escalated into a full war. The reason I'm choosing this war to talk about is it happened so long ago it shouldn't offend anybody. And also because it was a small war, I can sum it up very briefly, whereas to talk about Pearl Harbor or World War I, you know, it really took a long time. So, but it still illustrates a point that wars are often not fought for the reasons publicly given. Now, in 1937, the very eminent financial journalist Ferdinand Lundberg wrote a book called America's 60 Families, and in that book, he documented the fact that an oligarchy is actually controlling America, not the voters. And from the financial records, he showed that they had a controlling interest in the major corporations, that they owned most of the media from coast to coast, and they also controlled major politicians. Now that book helped inspire Gary Allen to write his book, Non-Dead Color Conspiracy, and that's what woke me up in 1978, and that inspired me in turn to write The Shadows of Power in 1988 for the Birch Society. I think it's been their #1 bestseller of all time. And it's about how the oligarchs use the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City to place their own people into administration cabinets, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat in office. And by the way, if any of you are familiar with Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum, you know that this is happening on a global scale. Now, because the oligarchs control both politicians and the media, they can foment wars and then sell it to you through the media. And if you take a look at most major political events, there's usually a public story and a backstory, the real story. So let's take the invasion of Mexico. It had a public story and a backstory, and I'm going to take the public story first. And the first part of this is true. In 1914, an American fleet was in the waters off of Tampico, which is a port city on Mexico's east coast. Now, Tampico had a lot of political unrest going on. They had some strict local ordinances in effect. Now, 8 sailors came into Tampico without first getting the permission that was required. And then they went into an area that had been declared off limits to foreigners. So as a result, they were arrested by soldiers of the Mexican army. Now there's some confusion at first because the sailors couldn't speak Spanish and the Mexicans couldn't speak English. So they brought them to the commanding officer and he explained to them what the city's port rules were. And then they were returned to their ship completely unharmed. That was the extent of the incident, a brief detainment. But President Woodrow Wilson, you might remember him, he's the guy who signed the Federal Reserve Act. He's the guy who had a hand in the Lusitania tragedy and exploited it to push us into World War I, and then used World War I to push the League of Nations. He was the primary pusher of that. And of course, that was the first attempt at world government. When America didn't join, that's what led to the founding of the Council on Foreign Relations, which has dedicated itself to world government ever since. Now, Wilson, regarding Mexico, he said that this arrest of our sailors had violated the dignity and the sovereignty of the United States. And he demanded 2 things from Mexico. Number 1, you have to issue an apology to us. Number 2, we demand that you raise the American flag on Mexican soil and fire a 21-gun salute to it. Now, the president of Mexico at that time was Victoriano Huerta, and Huerta said, look, if you want an apology, we'll give you an apology, but we're not going to fire a 21-gun salute to the American flag. We haven't done anything that deserves such an act of subservience. So President Wilson said, either you salute or we invade Mexico. And I'm not kidding about this. I know most of you can't read this from where you are. It's a newspaper headline at the time, and it says, President Wilson asked Congress for power to invade Mexico. Huerta will not accede to demands of U.S. force. Salute. It's got a political cartoon of Huerta. He's insulting the American flag as he tramples on poor little Woodrow Wilson. Now, Huerta stood firm, and so President Wilson ordered the entire U.S. Atlantic Fleet to sail to Mexico's eastern coast. And he also ordered the Pacific Fleet to sail to Mexico's west coast, although they didn't get involved. Now, here's another newspaper headline from the day, from 1914. And what it says is, Huerta must salute or Atlantic Fleet will seize Tampico and Veracruz. Super dreadnoughts, those are warships, of course, sail for Tampico to enforce the demand. I want to point out, Huerta said, look, why don't we just salute each other's flags and say it's all done with, you know? But Wilson said, no, we're not going to salute the Mexican flag, but you have to salute our flag. And I want to mention that this was illegal on Wilson's part. Nothing in the U.S. Constitution gave him this kind of authority, and nothing in international law gives the president of one nation the right to force another nation to salute his flag. But on April 21st, 1914, the Atlantic Fleet began bombarding Veracruz, and killing a large number of civilians. 500 Mexican civilians died that day, some of them from the bombardment, some of them street fighting. U.S. Marines and armed sailors then invaded Veracruz. I should mention that 80 U.S. soldiers refused to take part in the invasion. Why do you think that was? Because they were cowards? No, because they knew that it was ridiculous, and they weren't about to go around killing Mexicans and risk losing their own lives over this flag salute, which, by the way, I think, I've studied a lot of wars. I think it's the flimsiest excuse for a war I've ever heard of. Anyway, those guys were thrown into the brig in irons, but by the end of the day, 6,000 U.S. soldiers were on shore. There was intense street fighting for a little while. The Mexicans lost 126 dead, 195 soldiers wounded. America lost 22 dead, 70 wounded. And the Mexicans retreated. They had no chance against the U.S. military. And we then occupied Veracruz and placed under martial law. As you can imagine, the people of Mexico were outraged by this invasion, and they rallied behind their president. Okay, now what was the real reason we invaded Mexico? And some of you might wonder, well, what are your sources for this? What are your sources? Okay, well, one of my sources is Major General Smedley Butler, who, when he died in 1940, was the most decorated Marine in the history of the U.S. Marine Corps. And as a Major General, he was also the highest ranking officer in the history of the U.S. Marine Corps. And after he retired from the service during the 1930s, General Butler toured this country making a speech called War is a Racket. And he turned into a book by that name. And you won't find War is a Racket in your public library, but you can find it online. In this book, he revealed the real reason we invaded Mexico. And he was in a position to know because he commanded the 1st Battalion of Marines that invaded Veracruz. He was right there on the scene. He's given a medal for this action, but he refused it. He said he didn't deserve it, and he didn't want it. And so what was the real reason we invaded Mexico? Well, according to General Butler, it had absolutely nothing to do with the flag salute. It was all about oil. The most powerful man in America then was not President Woodrow Wilson. It was John D. Rockefeller, the president of Standard Oil and founder. Now, Standard Oil and other oil companies were taking Mexican oil without properly compensating the Mexican people. And President Huerta actually came to power by deposing his predecessor named Francisco Madero, who, according to Ferdinand Lundberg, was put in power by Standard Oil. Madero's own predecessor was named Diaz and wanted to tax Standard Oil. But now Huerta had taken over, and he once again wanted to see Mexico properly compensated for the oil that Standard Oil was taking out. And he also wanted to reduce foreign control of Mexico's resources and for Mexico to develop its own economy. And as a result, he was a branded enemy of Standard Oil. And so the oil interests went to Woodrow Wilson. They said, Huerta's got to go. And they just needed an excuse, right? This was a regime change war. Now, Huerta had a political rival, a revolutionary named Carranza, who was an ally of Pancho Villa, who I'm sure some of you have heard of. The United States now gave its support to Carranza. Wilson lifted an arms embargo on Carranza that had been placed on him by the previous administration, the Taft administration. And he was also paid $100,000 directly by Standard Oil, which is a lot of money in those days. So with U.S. support, Carranza staged a revolution in Mexico, and he forced Huerta out. This was a good deal for Carranza. He got to be rich and got to be president of Mexico. It was a good deal for the oil companies. They kept their status quo, and their oil profits of Mexican oil doubled over the next 5 years. I should mention, by the way, Huerta went into exile in Europe. In 1916, he was on his way back to Mexico, thinking he might be able to become president again. But he was traveling through America, and when he got to Texas, he was arrested and thrown in a Texas prison, where he quickly died. Some people think he was poisoned, but it can't be proven. But what's the lesson here? The lesson here that wars are often, I'll say usually, not fought for the reasons given. This is true of the Spanish-American War, our involvement in World War I, the Korean War, Vietnam, the Gulf War of '91, those incubator babies, and the 2003 war with the weapons of mass destruction that weren't there. There's always a public story, and then there's the backstory, the real story. And this is true, by the way, not just of wars, it's true of other things like the COVID lockdowns, the climate change agenda, our support of Ukraine. There's always a public story through the controlled media. And today, over 90% of all mainstream media outlets are controlled by just 5 corporations. The invasion of Mexico was a microcosm of what the U.S. oligarchs have been doing for decades, fomenting wars, often for regime change and to seize another country's assets. Not because they're patriots, this isn't for the American people's benefit, it's for their own benefit. well, thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I do have some books here that go into detail, especially 13 Pieces of the Jigsaw and Truth is a Lonely Warrior. Go into detail about Vietnam, a chapter on Korean War, Spanish-American War, Pearl Harbor, Iraq War, and so forth. So I also have books, as Hal mentioned, on Darwinism. My most recent book was a spiritual one that came out last year called Missing Saints, Missing Miracles. And
What was that last one?
Missing Saints, Missing Miracles. It's a, I came to the point of realizing we need divine intervention at this point for enough hope.
Who are the oligarchs
so,
of today?
Those are books are available, and I'll be, I don't want to interrupt other speakers,
Soros
I'll
is
be available
one of them.
after people are done,
We
the
can
speakers are
purchase
done.
them, right?
to,
Bill Gates.
Yeah, to, if any of you are interested in them. Thank you very much.
Thank you.